It's interesting to be back here, particularly if under Mr. Denham's charge for the three of us. And for my colleagues, I've been a supporter of high-speed rail in California, particularly as we become more urbanized, and it's an area that Mr. Richard and I worked on when we were in local government. Following a little bit on Mr. Lipinski's questions, but broadening it in your introductory comments, and we've talked about this before, particularly the JR model in Japan, where I think 25 or 30% of their operational revenue comes from land leases, and they broaden the space beyond what Mr. Lipinski was talking about, as I remember from my trips over there. As we urbanize in California at a rate that none of us expected, in San Francisco, the assessed value around the Transbay Terminal, which cost us $4 billion in the Bay Area, but we still need to get the Caltrain line, the extra mile from 3rd Street in there, which will cost $1.25 billion, and we're trying to find the revenue. The assessed value within the few blocks of the Transbay Terminal is being urbanized so intensely is $8 billion. So in Union Stations in Los Angeles, similar order of magnitude, San Jose, as you have mentioned. How does maybe the federal government play a role, as the Japanese federal government does, in incentivizing a proper investment that those private sector investments want as well? So all the people at Union Station who are now investing heavily in downtown Los Angeles, Fresno's going through the same thing. On the East Coast, you already have that. In terms of inner city investment, we did a trip, former Chairman Mica and I was on a trip to the 2nd Avenue subway in New York, most valuable real estate in the United States. And some of that, it would seem that at least the increase in the assessed value is a good investment back into the operations or the capital investment of the infrastructure. So could you comment a little further on that, about where the federal government might have a role based on your knowledge about other successful high-speed rail and intercity investments around the world, where they do it differently than we do it here in the United States?
Congressman DeSaulnier, thank you. The first thing that comes to mind is, I think in the state and local context, if you and I were back in 1996 thinking about how we would do this, knowing what we know today,
yeah, we probably wouldn't be here.
Well, you would be here. But I think that there was a missing link in California in terms of creating the initial authority for us as the rail authority to have control of the area around the station, so that we could harvest some of this uplift that you're talking about. I'm trying to recapture some of that now. I've created a transit land use committee, and we're trying to find ways to do that. As you know, our governor dissolved the redevelopment authorities. You and I worked on a redevelopment authority previously. Your question, though, was to the federal government, and I'd like to reflect on that and get back to you, but my initial thought on that is this. I think it goes to the generic role of the federal government and government in general if it wants to unleash the potential of the private sector, which is to recognize the risk profile at the beginning is very high in many cases for the private sector. And actually one other thing, if you look at, for example, Fresno, which is going to be a hub where high-speed rail is going to revitalize the downtown, they need about $800 million of infrastructure improvements, water, sewer, streets, internet, and so forth, because a private developer, as you and I saw in Pleasant Hill, cannot come in and make and carry those kinds of investments on their balance sheet. So I do think that the partnership here is, to the extent that there is governmental support for infrastructure, the private sector then both sees the risk profile come down and also sees that the infrastructure has been put in place that allows them to bring private dollars in. And I think that would be true in transit-oriented development as well as the broader infrastructure.
In the few seconds I have left, Mr. Picari, or any of the other witnesses you have, just capturing this investment. I mean, historically in the United States, we've let people speculate more than other countries and benefit from the infrastructure. And it seems like the Japanese have a different relationship in terms of risk. So could we do something to incentivize that behavior? And part of that allows for higher density, which a lot of the people in the community don't want, but then they do when they understand that this is the investment.
If I may, Congressman, there's a much more sophisticated view, I think, on both rail projects and transit projects nationally in terms of value capture. Thinking more holistically from the beginning, in your Second Avenue subway example of not capturing that value, subsequent phases of that or other projects from the beginning, thinking about the real estate value capture as an integral part for both capital and perhaps operating cost recovery for the projects.
Well, to the degree that any of you have in your work think that there's ways that we can incentivize this and do it appropriately so we're not taking away inappropriately from the private sector, but where there's a mutual benefit, I think would be all better served by your information.
One clear way to do that would be in the federal grant-making process, whether it's New Starts, core capacity grants, or others, to recognize that as part of one of the criteria for a grant application process.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Mr. Richard, one of the folks